I came home and found my fiancée on the kitchen counter with a guy pressed against her. She looked me dead in the eye and said, "So, what now?" That's when I came home earlier than I was supposed to, not because I was suspicious, not because I had a bad feeling, but because the site shut down for the night after a minor electrical issue. Nothing dramatic, nothing worth calling anyone about. I remember sitting in the car for a minute before going inside, checking a message from my supervisor and thinking how quiet the building looked with only a few lights on. The apartment door was unlocked. That alone should have registered as strange, but we lived in a building where people trusted each other more than they should, and Vanessa often forgot to lock it when she was home. I stepped inside, dropped my keys into the bowl by the door, and noticed shoes that were not mine. Not unfamiliar exactly, just not something I owned. They were pushed neatly against the wall, like someone had taken their time. I heard movement from the kitchen. Not the sound of cooking, not the clatter of dishes, but something heavier, rhythmic, careless. I walked forward without slowing down. The kitchen lights were on. Vanessa was sitting on the counter, one leg hooked around a man standing between her knees. Her dress was pushed up in a way that made it obvious this was not a rushed moment. The man had his hands on her hips like he belonged there. His jacket was already draped over the back of a chair, his phone face down on the table, his posture relaxed enough to tell me this was not his first time in this room. Vanessa turned her head first. She saw me immediately. She did not move. She did not pull away or gasp or scramble. She simply looked at me, calm, almost curious, like she was waiting to see if I would interrupt or observe. The man noticed her gaze shift and followed it. His face drained of color when he realized I was standing there. He froze in place, hands still on her, body stiff like someone caught mid-step on ice. Vanessa stayed exactly where she was. She studied my face, then said, evenly, that she had not expected me back so soon, and asked what I planned to do now. The question landed heavier than the scene itself. It told me everything about how long she had been ahead of me. I looked around the kitchen instead of answering. The wine bottle was already open. 2 glasses, one barely touched. Her purse was on the chair, open, as if she had come home with someone she trusted enough not to bother closing it. The counter had been cleared deliberately, space made. The man finally tried to step back, mumbling something that did not matter. Vanessa placed a hand on his shoulder, not forceful, just enough to stop him from moving. That small gesture did more damage than anything else in the room. I asked who he was. She said his name was Owen, like that was supposed to settle it. No explanation followed. No apology came after. She slid off the counter slowly, smoothing her dress like she was preparing to leave the house, not explaining why she had invited someone into our kitchen. Owen stood there, trapped between the two of us, eyes flicking back and forth. He started saying something about misunderstandings and timing and things not being what they looked like. Vanessa cut him off without raising her voice. She told him to give us a moment. He hesitated, then moved toward the hallway, grabbing his jacket. As he passed me, he avoided my eyes completely. The front door closed behind him. I did not hear it lock. Vanessa leaned back against the counter and crossed her arms. She asked again what I planned to do. She said it without sarcasm, without heat, like someone discussing logistics after a meeting. I asked how long. She shrugged. She said long enough for this to stop being a secret to everyone who mattered. She said it casually, like she was commenting on the weather. That was the moment something shifted. Not anger, not shock, but clarity. This was not a mistake that had just happened. This was something that had been maintained. I asked who knew. She did not answer directly. She said people had their own interpretations of things and that adults handled situations in different ways. She said I had been busy lately, distant, and that connections happened when people stopped feeling seen. It was rehearsed. Not word for word, but in rhythm. I could hear the practiced reasoning under the surface. I told her I was leaving for the night. She nodded like she had expected that. She said we would talk later and asked me not to make it harder than it needed to be. The phrasing bothered me more than anything else she had said so far. I walked toward the door, then stopped when I noticed Owen's jacket hanging beside mine in the closet. It was not tossed there. It had been placed carefully, shoulder to shoulder with my own. That detail stayed with me longer than the image in the kitchen. In the hallway outside the apartment, my phone vibrated. I checked it without thinking. The message was from Rachel Nolan. She asked if I had gotten home yet, and said Vanessa had mentioned earlier that the night might get complicated. The wording was vague, but the timestamp was not. The message had been sent hours before I walked into the apartment. I stood there longer than I should have, rereading it, trying to figure out how many conversations had happened without me in them. I left the building and drove without a destination for a while. My phone kept lighting up, but I did not answer. I replayed small things from the last few months that I had dismissed at the time. Vanessa being vague about schedules. Friends hesitating when I asked casual questions. Her insistence on separating certain expenses that we used to share. It added up too neatly. Later that night, I parked near a convenience store and checked my accounts. There were charges I did not recognize, nothing outrageous on their own, just enough to raise questions. A dinner here, a ride there, dates that lined up with evenings she had told me she was out with friends. Another message came in, this time from Derek Walsh, a guy I worked with occasionally who had met Vanessa a few times. He asked if everything was okay and said he had heard some confusing things earlier that week. He did not elaborate, but the fact that he reached out at all told me my name had already been circulating. I went back to the apartment close to midnight. The lights were off. Owen's shoes were gone. Vanessa was in the bedroom, asleep or pretending to be. I did not check. I took a bag from the closet and packed enough to last a few days. As I moved through the rooms, I noticed more things I had not before. Extra toiletries. A charger that was not mine. The faint sense that the apartment had been accommodating more than one version of her life. Before leaving, I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the counter where I had found them earlier. It was wiped clean now, spotless, like nothing had happened there at all. I left again without waking her. By the time I reached the hotel, my shock had been replaced by something steadier. Whatever Vanessa thought was going to happen next, it was clear she believed she had already won control of the narrative. That belief was going to be her first mistake. I woke up in the hotel with the sense that time had moved without me. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes small sounds feel louder than they should. My phone was face down on the nightstand, and for a moment I considered leaving it there. That idea passed quickly. Whatever was happening had already started whether I watched it or not. When I turned the phone over, there were messages waiting. Not a flood, not panic, just enough to show that people had been talking. Rachel had sent another message during the night, shorter than the first, asking if I was okay and saying she hoped things had not gotten messy. Derek had followed up with a vague comment about work schedules and asking if I needed to swap shifts later in the week. Vanessa had not messaged at all. That absence was deliberate. It told me she was waiting, not worried. I showered, got dressed, and went downstairs for coffee. I did not feel sick or dizzy or overwhelmed. I felt alert in a way that surprised me. The picture from the kitchen had stopped looping in my head, replaced by something more analytical. If Vanessa was calm enough to challenge me, it meant she believed the situation had already been shaped in her favor. That meant the real story was not starting now. It had started earlier. I called Rachel. She answered after a long pause, like she had been debating whether to pick up. Her voice was careful. She said she did not know how much she should say and that she did not want to make things worse. I told her I was not looking for reassurance, only accuracy. She admitted that Vanessa had been talking for weeks. Not loudly, not dramatically, but consistently. She had framed the relationship as something that was fading. She had said I was focused on work, distant, emotionally checked out. She had hinted that we were already living parallel lives. None of it sounded extreme enough to trigger alarm. It sounded reasonable enough to accept without question. Rachel said Owen had been around longer than I realized. Not in obvious ways, not openly, but present. He had shown up at group outings a few times under the explanation that he worked with Vanessa's cousin Megan. People assumed he was adjacent, not central. I asked if anyone had questioned it. Rachel said no one wanted to be the one to ask. Vanessa had always been good at making situations feel settled before anyone thought to challenge them. When I hung up, I sat there for a while, watching people move through the lobby with luggage and coffee cups, each of them heading somewhere specific. Vanessa had been doing the same thing for months, just without me noticing. I drove past the apartment later that morning, but did not go in. Instead, I stopped at the bank. The accounts were still joint, still accessible, still quiet. The irregular charges were not dramatic, but the pattern was clear. Meals, rides, small purchases that made sense individually and told a story collectively. It was not theft. It was preparation. From there, I went to work. That decision surprised a few people. Derek raised his eyebrows when he saw me. He asked if everything was okay in a way that suggested he already knew the answer. I told him I was fine and asked what he had meant in his message. He hesitated, then admitted that Megan had said something odd earlier in the week. She had mentioned that Vanessa was probably going to need support soon because big changes were coming. Derek had assumed it was about a job shift or a move. I asked if my name had come up. He said not directly, but it had been implied. By lunchtime, I understood that there was already a version of me circulating. Not an abusive one, not a villain, but a placeholder. The guy who had drifted away. The partner who had been emotionally absent. The one whose replacement felt inevitable rather than shocking. That version did not shout or fight back. That version quietly exited. I left work early and went to see Owen. He lived across town in a newer building with a gym and a shared courtyard. I did not tell him I was coming. I waited until he came down to the parking garage and intercepted him by his car. He froze when he saw me, the same way he had in the kitchen, like his instincts were slow to update. I told him I was not there to argue. That seemed to confuse him more than anger would have. He started explaining himself anyway. He said Vanessa had told him the relationship was functionally over. He said he had been told I was aware on some level. He said he believed things were winding down cleanly. I asked how long. He admitted it had been months. I asked if he had ever been to the apartment before that night. He hesitated long enough to answer the question without words. He said Vanessa had assured him I was rarely home, that I traveled more than I actually did, that the timing was safe, that the risk was minimal. I thanked him for being honest and left him standing there, looking like someone who had just realized the rules of a game had changed. That evening, Vanessa finally messaged me. She asked where I was and said we needed to talk like adults. The phrasing was familiar now. It was the same tone she had used in the kitchen, calm, managerial, like she was moderating a discussion rather than dealing with damage. I told her I would be in touch when I was ready. That was enough to break the pattern. She called immediately. I did not answer. She called again. Then she texted something sharper, something closer to frustration. The confidence was cracking around the edges. Later that night, I got a message from Megan. She said she had heard there was tension and wanted to make sure everyone stayed civil. She reminded me that relationships changed and that no one benefited from public conflict. The message was polite, but the subtext was clear. Keep it quiet. Keep it clean. Do not disrupt the story. I replied that I had no intention of causing scenes, but I also had no intention of playing along with something I had not agreed to. There was no response after that. I went back to the hotel and laid everything out on the bed. Bank statements, dates, notes I had written to myself throughout the day. It was not about catching Vanessa in lies. It was about understanding the structure she had built. She had layered her life so that each person only saw the part that made sense to them. No single lie was dramatic. Together, they formed a system. The realization settled heavily. Vanessa had not been reckless. She had been efficient. The next morning, I received a notification from our property management company. A routine email, but it mentioned inquiries about lease modifications. The timing lined up too well to ignore. She had been asking questions about exit options before I ever walked into the kitchen. I forwarded the email to my personal account and closed the laptop. By the end of the second day, it was clear that whatever confrontation was coming next would not be about what I had seen on the counter. That moment had only exposed the surface. The real conflict was about control, and Vanessa had assumed she would keep it. That assumption was starting to fail. The third day was when the separate threads stopped behaving like separate threads. Up until then, everything had been contained in private conversations, careful messages, and indirect pressure. It had felt like standing inside a room with multiple ticking clocks, each one slightly out of sync. On the third day, they started chiming together. It began with a call from the property management office. The woman on the line sounded overly polite, the way people do when they have already decided something but still need to deliver it gently. She said there had been inquiries about removing one tenant from the lease and asked if I was aware of any upcoming changes. She emphasized that no action had been taken yet and that this was simply a confirmation call. I told her I was not aware of any changes and asked who had made the inquiry. She paused just long enough to confirm it without saying the name. That pause was enough. After the call, I sat on the edge of the bed and thought about how many systems Vanessa had been interacting with quietly. Not dramatically, not urgently, just enough to keep doors open. Housing, finances, social circles. The relationship itself had been reduced to another variable to manage. I went back to the apartment that afternoon while I knew she would be at work. I did not announce myself. I used my key, the same key that had opened the door on the first night. The apartment felt different now. Not hostile. Strategic. Drawers had been reorganized. Closet space subtly shifted. Items that used to be shared had been separated without discussion. I noticed paperwork stacked neatly in a folder on the desk. Not hidden, just placed where someone would not normally look unless they were already searching. The folder contained copies of bank statements, a printed lease, and notes written in Vanessa's handwriting. Short bullet points. Exit dates, cost estimates, names of people to contact. It read like a project outline. I did not take the folder. I photographed it and put it back exactly where it had been. On my way out, I ran into a neighbor from down the hall. He asked if everything was okay and mentioned he had seen Vanessa upset the night before. He said she told him there had been an argument and that things were probably ending. He spoke like he was relaying weather updates. I thanked him and left. By the time I reached the lobby, my phone was vibrating again. This time it was Derek. He sounded uncomfortable before he even said anything. He told me there had been a conversation at work involving Owen that did not sit right with him. Owen had requested time off retroactively and had given an explanation that did not line up with previous schedules. Management had noticed. Derek said he had not mentioned my name, but the overlap was obvious to anyone paying attention. That was the first visible crack outside of our circle. Later that evening, Rachel called again. She sounded tired. She said Vanessa had been pressing people for reassurance, asking if anyone had heard from me, trying to gauge how much control she still had over the room. Rachel said she finally told Vanessa that she was done carrying messages and done smoothing things over. Vanessa had not taken that well. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Vanessa stopped framing things as mutual understanding and started framing them as damage control. She messaged me again, longer this time, explaining that she wanted to avoid unnecessary escalation and that airing things publicly would only hurt everyone involved. I did not respond. Instead, I forwarded copies of the joint financial summaries to my personal account and contacted the bank to ask about separating access. I did not accuse. I did not demand. I asked questions. The kind of questions that create records. That night, Owen reached out. The message was brief and awkward. He said he thought I should know that Vanessa had told him I was reacting unpredictably and that she was worried about how far I might take things. He said he did not want to be caught in the middle. The phrasing was important. It was not concern. It was positioning. I replied once. I told him he was already in the middle and had been for months, whether he realized it or not. There was no response after that. The following morning, Megan showed up at the apartment unannounced. I had come back briefly to collect documents and found her standing outside the door, arms crossed, expression fixed in a way that suggested she had rehearsed what she wanted to say. She told me Vanessa was under a lot of stress and that this situation did not need to become destructive. She said people were starting to ask questions and that reputations were fragile things. She said it would be best if we handled things privately and with maturity. I asked her what version of events she had been given. She hesitated, then gave me a version that omitted entire months. It framed Owen as a late development and the relationship as something that had already ended emotionally. It placed the discovery as unfortunate timing rather than consequence. I told her that version did not match the documents in the apartment or the financial records or the lease inquiries. Her face changed then, not dramatically, just enough to show she had not expected resistance that specific. She warned me that pushing back would make things worse for everyone. That was when Vanessa appeared behind her, having returned early from work. The timing felt intentional. Vanessa looked tired for the first time since the kitchen. Not guilty, not ashamed, just irritated that the situation was no longer moving according to plan. She told Megan they should talk later and asked me, again, to be reasonable. I asked her if the folder on the desk was part of her version of reason. She stared at me for a long moment. Then she said I was invading her privacy and that my behavior was becoming concerning. She said this loudly enough for Megan to hear clearly. The escalation was immediate and calculated. I did not argue. I told her I would be communicating through appropriate channels from now on and that I expected the same. Then I left the apartment with Megan still standing there, looking between us like someone who had just realized she had walked into the wrong room. By that afternoon, the story had started slipping out of Vanessa's control, not because I exposed it, but because it could no longer stay contained. Too many people had pieces that did not fit. Too many timelines overlapped. Owen stopped answering her messages. That much I learned later from Rachel, who had seen Vanessa checking her phone repeatedly at a gathering she attended that evening. The confidence was gone. The composure was thinning. That night, Vanessa sent me a message that crossed a line. She suggested that if I continued acting unpredictably, she would be forced to explain things in a way that would not reflect well on me. She did not specify what that meant. She did not have to. I saved the message and did not respond. The next morning, I finalized the separation of the accounts. Not aggressively, cleanly, legally. The bank representative asked routine questions and documented everything. When Vanessa realized what I had done, she called repeatedly. This time, the calm tone was gone. She accused me of trying to punish her financially and of acting out of spite. I told her the finances were no longer shared and that this was not a punishment. It was alignment with reality. That conversation ended abruptly. By the end of the week, Owen had requested a transfer at work. The reason given was vague. Management did not announce anything, but the change was visible enough to fuel speculation. Vanessa's family began asking direct questions instead of accepting summaries. Friends started choosing silence over participation. The structure Vanessa had built did not collapse all at once. It sagged. It bent. It exposed weak points she had assumed would never be tested. The moment she realized she was losing control was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, and it terrified her. By the time the fourth week began, the situation no longer belonged to any single conversation or person. It had grown beyond private explanations and careful phrasing. It existed on paper now, inside systems that did not respond to tone or intention. That was where Vanessa lost what remained of her advantage. The formal notice came first. The property management company sent an email outlining options for lease modification, citing previous inquiries and recent changes in financial responsibility. The language was neutral, procedural, indifferent to the emotions involved. Vanessa forwarded it to me with a short message asking why I was doing this to her. I did not reply. I contacted the management office directly and confirmed that I would be vacating my portion of the lease under the terms available. The process was slower than an argument, but far more permanent. Dates were set. Penalties were calculated. Records were updated. Vanessa showed up at the hotel that evening. She did not knock. She waited in the lobby and called repeatedly until I answered. When I came down, she stood up too quickly, like someone who had been sitting in tension for too long. Her composure was uneven now, her confidence replaced by urgency. She accused me of blindsiding her. She said she had assumed we would talk through everything before making decisions that affected her stability. She said I was being cold and unreasonable. She said I was punishing her for moving on. I told her I was responding to actions that had already been taken. I reminded her of the lease inquiries, the financial planning, the folder on the desk. I said nothing about the kitchen counter. That moment no longer mattered in the way she thought it did. She tried to redirect the conversation. She said Owen was no longer involved and that things had gotten complicated beyond anyone's control. She said mistakes had been made on all sides. She said people were starting to talk and that this was getting out of hand. I told her that control was not something you lost suddenly. It was something that wore down when assumptions stopped holding. She left without another word. The next development came from the bank. The review flagged inconsistencies that required clarification. Nothing criminal, nothing dramatic, but enough to trigger a formal inquiry into how shared funds had been allocated. Vanessa called again when she received the notification. This time, her voice was tight with panic. She said I had promised to protect her. She said I was exposing her to consequences she had never anticipated. She said she never meant for things to go this far. I told her that what she had anticipated was irrelevant now. At the same time, Owen's situation unraveled more quietly. His transfer request stalled. Questions about overlapping time off and expense reimbursements did not resolve themselves the way he had hoped. His name stopped coming up casually and started appearing in meetings where it had never appeared before. He reached out once more, asking if there was any way to smooth things over. I did not respond. Vanessa's family requested a meeting. Not a confrontation, not an intervention, just clarity. They had been given too many partial explanations and too many versions that contradicted each other. I attended without dramatics and answered questions directly. Dates, documents, sequences. I did not editorialize. I did not assign motives. The effect was immediate. Support shifted from assumption to distance. Vanessa was not cut off entirely, but the unconditional backing she had relied on evaporated. Conversations became cautious. Offers became conditional. The future she had spoken about so confidently began to look uncertain even to her. The engagement was dissolved through formal channels. Vendors were notified. Deposits were forfeited. No announcements were made. The absence of celebration was more noticeable than any public fallout would have been. Vanessa moved out of the apartment 2 weeks later. She asked if I wanted anything from the place. I told her to keep whatever she needed. The answer seemed to frustrate her more than a demand would have. By the time the last account was closed and the final paperwork signed, there was very little left to say. Vanessa tried once more to frame the outcome as mutual misunderstanding, as two people who had grown apart and handled it poorly. The phrasing sounded tired even to her. I did not correct her. What mattered was not how the story ended, but who still believed they could shape it. Vanessa had entered the situation convinced that confidence alone would carry her through. That calm would override consequence. That preparation guaranteed immunity. What she learned instead was that preparation only works when no one else stops playing along. Owen faded out of her life completely, not with a dramatic break, but with silence and logistical obstacles that made further involvement inconvenient. His career recovered slowly, but the momentum he had relied on never fully returned. Vanessa's life did not collapse overnight. It narrowed. Options disappeared. Support thinned. Decisions became reactive instead of strategic. Mine stabilized. I moved forward without announcements or declarations. I did not win anything. I simply stopped losing ground. The kitchen counter was cleaned. The apartment was emptied. The future that had been scheduled without my consent was canceled. What remained was quieter, more solid, and finally mine again.